In the winter of 1840, in the shadow of the Carpathian Mountains, humanity had grown comfortable with cruelty. The slave markets that dotted Eastern Europe operated with the casual efficiency of butcher shops, and on this particular frozen evening in the city of Vlachia, something unspeakable was about to occur. A widow named Eleanor Ashford, 28 years old, with hollow cheeks and trembling hands, stood on an auction block beside her daughter, 10-year-old Catherine, whose blue eyes held a terror too ancient for her years. They had been placed in separate lots, a merchant's cold calculation to extract maximum profit from desperation. But the auction house, with its velvet curtains and crystal chandeliers, funded by human misery, did not know that in the private box, overlooking the floor, sat someone who had not fed in 3 weeks. Someone whose hunger was matched only by his hatred of men who broke families apart. Lord Victor Draconis had lived for 347 years, and in all that time he had maintained one inviolable rule: never interfere with human affairs. Tonight, that rule would shatter like the champagne glasses in the hands of merchants when they realized a predator had entered their sanctuary. And he was not there to buy. He was there to burn their world down. The auction house stank of desperation, masked by expensive perfume. A combination that made Victor's heightened senses recoil even from his concealed position in the uppermost private box. He had not intended to come here tonight. Had in fact sworn to himself that he would stay in his manor house on the hill and complete the translation of a Byzantine manuscript that had occupied his attention for the past 6 months. But hunger had a way of making even the most disciplined vampire break their carefully constructed routines. 3 weeks without feeding had turned his normally pale complexion into something resembling parchment, and his hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, trembled with the effort of maintaining control. He had come to the auction house because it was the one place in Vlachia where blood flowed freely, where the scent of fear and desperation created a buffet for supernatural senses, and where he could feed on the ambient terror without actually touching a single human being. A compromise he had perfected over the past century when he grew tired of leaving corpses in his wake. Below him, the auction floor buzzed with the kind of animated conversation that accompanied great wealth, confronting human suffering with complete indifference. Men in tailcoats, worth more than most families earned in a year, gestured with cigars that cost more than a week's wages, discussing the merchandise with the same enthusiasm they brought to horse trading. Women in silk gowns that whispered secrets with every movement fanned themselves delicately, their jeweled fingers occasionally pointing toward the stage where the auctioneer, a corpulent man named Heinrich Marlowe, prepared for the evening's main event. Victor had seen Marlowe operate before, had watched him sell everything from stolen art to kidnapped children with the same practiced charm, and the vampire had always resisted the urge to snap the man's neck because interfering with human affairs led to complications that could expose his nature, and exposure meant hunters. And hunters meant relocating to a new city and starting the exhausting process of building a new identity from scratch. The chandeliers overhead cast a warm golden glow that contrasted obscenely with the cold transactions occurring beneath them, and Victor found himself gripping the velvet railing of his box hard enough that his fingernails, sharp as razors, began to tear through the fabric. He needed to feed soon or leave immediately, because the hunger was beginning to cloud his judgment, beginning to make the pulse points in every neck below him seem like invitation rather than temptation. And he had not survived 3 centuries by succumbing to base instincts in public spaces. He was about to rise and depart when Marlowe's voice, amplified by the exceptional acoustics of the auction house, cut through the ambient conversation with practiced authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to the most unusual lot of the evening," Marlowe announced, his jowls quivering with barely suppressed excitement. "Lot 47, a matched set that I assure you will never be offered again in this establishment." Victor froze halfway out of his seat because the word matched set in the Context of human trafficking meant only one thing, and he felt a cold fury begin to replace the gnawing hunger in his chest. He had seen many atrocities in his long existence, had in fact committed a fair number of them himself during the darker centuries of his youth. But there were certain lines that even monsters recognized, certain boundaries that separated those who could still claim some fragment of humanity from those who had surrendered to the void completely. He settled back into his chair, his trembling hands now still with the kind of focus that came before violence, and watched as two figures were led onto the stage by guards whose faces betrayed no emotion whatsoever. The woman came first, and Victor's breath caught despite not needing to breathe at all. She was thin in the way that spoke of prolonged starvation rather than natural constitution. Her dark hair hanging in tangled curtains around a face that might have been beautiful before grief carved it into something harder. She wore a simple grey dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was difficult to discern, and her hands, chapped raw from cold and labour, clutched at the chains binding her wrists with the mechanical desperation of someone who had long since abandoned hope but could not quite stop fighting. Her eyes, a remarkable shade of green that caught the chandelier light, swept the crowd with undisguised hatred, and Victor felt something unexpected stir in his chest, something he had not experienced in decades, a recognition of kindred fury in another creature's gaze, behind the woman, connected by a short length of chain that ensured they could not be separated by more than 3 feet. Walked a child, and it was the child who shattered the last of Victor's carefully maintained detachment. She could not have been more than 10 years old, with blonde hair that someone had recently attempted to brush into submission and eyes the color of a winter sky just before snow. She wore a dress that had clearly been the woman's once, cut down and resized with careful stitches that spoke of maternal love attempting to clothe a child with nothing but scraps and determination. The girl's face held an expression Victor had seen on battlefields, in plague houses, in all the places where children were forced to become adults before their time. A terrible awareness that the world was cruel and that no one was coming to save them. Eleanor Ashford, 28 years of age, and her daughter Catherine, 10 years old, Marlowe continued, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man who had sold his soul so long ago he no longer remembered having one. Formerly of a respectable merchant family, fallen on unfortunate times. The woman is literate, can keep household accounts, and has experience in managing domestic staff. The child is healthy, obedient, and has been raised with proper discipline. Victor's fingers punctured the armrest of his chair, splintering the wood beneath velvet as he processed what he was hearing. They were not just being sold, they were being sold separately. A fact that became crystal clear when Marlowe gestured toward a large placard being wheeled onto the stage. "Now, I know what you're thinking," Marlowe said with a showman's timing. "Why separate such a lovely pair? But I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, there is method to this arrangement. Lot 47A, the woman Eleanor, starting bid of 100 florins. Lot 47B, the girl Catherine, starting bid of 150 florins. Each sold separately to maximize value for our consigners. The crowd's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Hands shot up across the auction floor, voices called out bids with the same casual interest they might show for furniture. And Victor watched as the numbers climbed with sickening speed. 200 florins for Eleanor, 225 for Catherine. The bids came faster now, competing interests revealing themselves as men who wanted domestic servants competed with men whose interests were considerably darker. And Victor felt his control slipping not from hunger now, but from rage. On the stage, Eleanor had begun to scream, not the theatrical screaming of someone seeking attention, but the raw, animal sound of a mother watching her child being taken from her. She lunged forward despite the chains, despite the guard who immediately grabbed her arms, despite the impossibility of reaching the girl who stood frozen in terror 3 feet away. Please!" Eleanor's voice cracked with desperation. "Please, she's just a child." Take me twice over, but don't separate us. She's all I have. She's all I have in this world." Catherine had not moved, had not made a sound, but tears streamed down her small face in silent rivers, and her lips moved in what Victor's supernatural hearing could just barely discern as a repeated prayer. "Mama, mama, mama, 300 florins for the woman." Someone shouted from the front row, a merchant whose cologne was so overpowering Victor could smell it even from his elevated position. 375 for the girl, countered a voice from the opposite side, belonging to a man whose thoughts Victor did not want to read because the hunger radiating from him had nothing to do with food. Marlowe beamed, his face flushed with the excitement of a successful sale. "Wonderful enthusiasm, ladies and gentlemen. Shall we say 400 for the woman? Do I hear 400? Victor stood, and the temperature in the auction house dropped 10 degrees in an instant. He did not consciously decide to intervene, did not weigh the consequences or consider the complications. He simply moved with the supernatural speed that made vampires apex predators, and in the span of a single heartbeat he crossed the distance from his private box to the auction floor, appearing directly between Eleanor and Marlowe with such suddenness that several people in the front row gasped and stumbled backward. The auctioneer's smile froze on his face as he found himself staring into eyes that had gone from pale grey to solid black, pupils dilated with a hunger that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with violence. Victor was not a large man by the standards of 1840, standing perhaps 5 feet 10 inches in his custom-fitted boots, but there was something in his stillness that suggested coiled power, that made every survival instinct in Marlowe's well-fed body scream at him to run. "The auction," Victor said softly, his voice carrying nonetheless to every corner of the room despite its volume, "is over." Marlowe recovered quickly, credit to his years of dealing with difficult clients. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but this is a private establishment, and you cannot simply—" Victor moved again, this time just his hand, which shot out and gripped Marlowe's wrist with enough force to crack bones. The auctioneer's scream was immediate and gratifying, and Victor leaned in close enough that only Marlowe could hear his next words. "I am Lord Victor Draconis, and I have lived in this city since before your grandfather was born. I own the land your establishment sits on. I hold debt notes from half the men in this room, and if you do not release these women immediately, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that you never sell anything in this city again, including the clothes off your own back." It was a lie, of course. Victor owned property throughout Vlachia, but not this particular building. And while he had accumulated considerable wealth over 3 centuries, he made a point of staying out of the city's financial affairs to avoid drawing attention. But Marlowe did not know that. And more importantly, the men in the audience who had stopped bidding and started paying very close attention did not know that either. The Draconis name carried weight in certain circles, old money and older bloodlines, and Victor had carefully cultivated a reputation as someone who preferred to be left alone, which meant when he did involve himself in affairs, people paid attention. Marlowe's face had gone from red to white in the space of seconds. "My lord, I assure you this is all perfectly legal. The consignment papers are in order. The previous owner had every right—" "I'm purchasing both lots," Victor interrupted, releasing Marlowe's wrist and reaching into his coat to withdraw a leather wallet. 5,000 florins for both, right now, in gold. The sum was absurd, nearly 10 times what the bidding had reached, and the auction floor erupted in whispers. 5,000 florins was the kind of money that bought estates, not individual servants. And Victor could see the calculation happening behind Marlowe's eyes. Greed warring with the pain in his wrist and the fear of the man who had broken it. "My lord, the other bidders." Marlowe gestured weakly toward the crowd. Victor turned to face the audience, and this time he let them see what he was. Let the predator show through the civilized veneer he normally maintained. His eyes had gone fully black now, not just the pupils, but the whites as well. And when he smiled there was no warmth in it, just the promise of teeth in the dark. "Does anyone," he asked conversationally, "wish to outbid me?" The silence was absolute. Men who had been shouting bids moments ago suddenly found their shoes fascinating. Women who had been pointing and discussing turned away, seeking safety in their companions. Even the guards flanking the stage had taken several steps back, their hands moving instinctively toward weapons they knew would be useless against whatever this man was. Victor turned back to Marlowe. "I believe we have an agreement. 5,000 florins. Release them now, or I will take them anyway, and you will have nothing but broken bones and bad dreams." Marlowe made the only decision a man in his position could make. He nodded frantically toward the guards, who scrambled to unlock the chains, binding Eleanor and Catherine. Victor counted out the gold coins with deliberate slowness, stacking them on the auction block, where everyone could see the small fortune accumulating. And with each coin, he let a small amount of his supernatural aura leak out, a pressure in the air that made breathing difficult and thinking harder. When the chains fell away, Eleanor immediately grabbed Catherine, pulling the girl against her chest with a force that must have hurt. But the child did not complain, just buried her face in her mother's shoulder, and finally began to sob in earnest. Victor watched them for a moment, watched the way Eleanor's hands moved over her daughter's hair, checking for injuries, offering comfort, rebuilding the connection that had almost been severed forever. And he felt the last of his hunger fade away, replaced by something far more dangerous. He had forgotten in his long existence what it felt like to care about something beyond his own survival. He had forgotten what it meant to look at another creature and see not prey or threat or obstacle, but something worth protecting. The realization should have terrified him, should have sent him fleeing back to his manor house to barricade himself behind ancient protections and older fears. But instead, he found himself reaching into his coat for a second wallet, this one containing not gold but papers. "You," he said to Marlowe, his voice still soft but carrying an edge that made the auctioneer flinch, "will provide me with the consignment documents, the ownership papers, and the names of everyone involved in bringing these women here. You will do this within the hour, or I will return, and I will not be as civilized as I have been tonight." Marlowe nodded so hard his jowls shook. "Yes, my lord, immediately, of course." "I'll have my clerk within the hour," Victor repeated, and turned to Eleanor and Catherine, who were still clinging to each other as if separation might yet be forced upon them. "Can you walk?" Eleanor looked up at him, and Victor saw that her green eyes held no gratitude, only suspicion and exhausted wariness. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice hoarse from screaming. "What do you want from us?" It was the right question, the smart question, the question of a woman who had learned that men who intervened in auctions did so for their own reasons, and those reasons were rarely altruistic. Victor appreciated her intelligence even as he recognized the problem it presented, because he did not have a good answer, did not understand his own motivations well enough to explain them to someone else. "My name is Victor Draconis," he said finally. "I want nothing from you except to get you out of this place before someone gets brave enough to challenge my claim. We will discuss the rest later, somewhere safer." "Can you walk?" he repeated. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, her arms still wrapped around Catherine, and Victor could see her weighing impossible options. Trust the stranger who just spent a fortune to buy them, or stay in the auction house where men with darker intentions waited for the strange nobleman to leave. It was not really a choice at all, and they both knew it. "We can walk," Eleanor said quietly, and stood bringing Catherine with her. The girl had not let go of her mother, had wrapped both arms and legs around Eleanor like a much younger child, and Eleanor carried her without complaint, despite her own obvious weakness. Victor nodded and gestured toward the main doors, where his carriage waited with his driver, who had served him for 20 years and knew better than to ask questions about unusual passengers. The crowd parted before them like water before a ship's prow, and Victor noted with grim satisfaction that several of the men who had been bidding most enthusiastically were nowhere to be seen. Having apparently decided that discretion was the better part of survival, they were almost to the doors when a voice called out from behind them, young and drunk and stupid, the worst possible combination. Wait just a moment. You can't just walk out with merchandise. I had a legitimate bid on the girl, and I demand... Victor moved. One moment he was walking toward the door with Eleanor and Catherine. The next, he was behind the speaker. A young nobleman whose expensive clothes could not disguise his fundamental worthlessness. With one hand wrapped around the man's throat and the other positioned to snap his neck with a simple twist. "You demand nothing," Victor whispered into the young man's ear. "You go home. You forget you were here tonight. You forget you ever saw them. And if I hear that you have spoken one word about this evening, if I catch even a whisper of your voice describing what happened here, I will find you, and I will show you what demands really mean in the dark. Do you understand me?" The young nobleman made a strangled sound that might have been agreement, and Victor released him, letting him collapse to the floor in a heap of silk and terror. No one else spoke. No one else moved. Victor returned to Eleanor and Catherine and guided them through the doors into the frozen night beyond. The carriage ride was silent except for Catherine's quiet crying and the sound of hoofbeats on cobblestones. Victor sat across from Eleanor and her daughter, watching the way the woman's hands never stopped moving, checking Catherine's face, her arms, her hands, looking for damage that might have been inflicted during their time in the auction house's holding cells. He should have been planning his next move, should have been considering the complications he had just created for himself. But instead, he found himself memorizing the way Eleanor's jaw clenched when she thought he was not looking. The way her eyes kept darting to the carriage door, as if calculating whether she could escape with Catherine before he could stop them. "Where are you taking us?" Eleanor asked finally, her voice steady despite the fear Victor could smell on her skin. "My home," Victor replied. "You'll be safe there." "Safe from everyone except you," Eleanor said flatly. And Victor felt something like respect cut through his exhaustion. "Yes," he agreed, "because lying would have been pointless. But I have no intention of harming you, if that provides any comfort." "It doesn't," Eleanor said. But she settled back against the carriage seat anyway, still holding Catherine, still maintaining her vigil, and Victor understood that she had made the same calculation he had seen her make in the auction house. She would accept his help because she had no other options, but she would never trust him. And she would escape the first moment she believed it was possible. The carriage climbed the hill toward Victor's manor house, leaving the lights of Vlachia behind, and Victor wondered what he had just done, what ancient and careful patterns he had just destroyed by interfering with the brutal machinery of human cruelty. He had survived 3 centuries by remaining detached, by treating human affairs as theatre he occasionally observed but never participated in. And now he had purchased a woman and her child for a fortune, had threatened one of the city's most successful merchants, and had revealed aspects of his nature to dozens of witnesses who would talk despite his threats. Because gossip was currency in places like auction houses, it was the most foolish thing he had done in 100 years. And as the carriage pulled up to his home, and he saw Eleanor's eyes widen at the size of the estate, at the implications of wealth and power that came with such a property, Victor realized with perfect clarity that he did not regret it at all. And that terrified him far more than any hunter or exposure ever could. The manor house loomed against the night sky like something from a Gothic nightmare, all sharp towers and darker shadows. And Eleanor felt Catherine's grip tighten around her neck as the carriage rolled to a stop before doors that looked capable of withstanding a siege. She had heard stories about the estates on the hill above Vlachia, whispered tales in the market squares about old families with older money who kept to themselves and emerged only when business required it. But she had never imagined she would see one from anything other than a distance. The building before her was not merely large. It was vast in a way that suggested generations of accumulated wealth. Stone walls that had weathered centuries and windows that reflected moonlight like watching eyes. Eleanor's first instinct was to run, to grab Catherine and flee into the frozen woods surrounding the estate, but she was exhausted, starving, and the child in her arms weighed barely 60 pounds soaking wet because they had not eaten properly in weeks. Running would mean death by exposure, and she had not survived the past year of horrors only to freeze to death in a forest because pride prevented her from accepting help. Even help from a man whose eyes had turned black as coal in the auction house. Lord Victor Draconis stepped down from the carriage with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural, as if gravity affected him differently than it did normal men, and Eleanor noticed details she had been too terrified to process in the auction house. He was pale, not the pallor of illness, but something more fundamental, as if sunlight had never touched his skin and never would. His dark hair was pulled back in a style 20 years out of fashion, and his clothes, while expensive, belonged to an earlier era. The kind of formal wear her grandfather might have recognized, but that modern tailors had abandoned. His hands, extended now to help her down from the carriage, were cold enough that she could feel the chill through her thin dress, and when their fingers touched, she felt a shock run through her that had nothing to do with temperature, and everything to do with the recognition that this man was not quite human, that whatever had purchased her and Catherine in the auction house wore humanity like an ill-fitting costume. "Mrs. Ashford," Victor said quietly, and Eleanor noted that he had switched to the respectful address rather than using her first name, a small courtesy that meant everything or nothing depending on what came next. "My housekeeper will show you to rooms where you and Catherine can rest. Food will be brought. In the morning, when you've recovered somewhat, we can discuss what happens next." Eleanor wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, wanted to scream that there was no recovering from what they had endured, no rest deep enough to erase the memory of standing on that stage while men bid on her child like livestock. But Catherine had finally stopped crying and was breathing in the deep, exhausted rhythm of a child pushed beyond endurance into something resembling sleep. And Eleanor would not wake her, would not let her fear show when her daughter needed her to be strong. So instead, she nodded and followed Victor, through the massive doors, into an entrance hall that took her breath away, despite her determination to remain unimpressed. The interior of the manor was both more and less than she had expected. More because the sheer scale of wealth on display was staggering, less because, instead of the cold showmanship she associated with new money, everything here spoke of age and careful preservation. The floors were polished marble worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The tapestries on the walls depicted battles from wars she only half remembered from history lessons. And the furniture, what she could see of it in the dim gaslight, belonged to styles that had been fashionable when her great-grandmother was young. It was the home of someone who had lived in one place for a very long time, who had accumulated possessions not to display wealth, but because they had simply been there to accumulate. And Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature as she realized exactly how old Lord Draconis might actually be. A woman appeared from a side corridor, elderly and severe in a black dress that rustled with starch. Her grey hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her already thin face into something resembling a skull. She looked at Eleanor and Catherine with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been indigestion. It was difficult to tell, and when she spoke, her voice carried the flat authority of someone who had managed large households for decades and would tolerate no nonsense from anyone. "Lord or servant, Mrs. Ashford, I am Mrs. Halloway." "The housekeeper," the woman said briskly. "Follow me, please. His lordship has instructed that you and the child be given the blue suite in the east wing. It has not been used in some years, but I have had fires lit and beds prepared." Eleanor glanced back at Victor, who had not moved from his position near the door, and found him watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His eyes had returned to their normal pale grey, but there was something in his gaze that reminded her of a cat watching a mouse. Not with immediate hunger, but with the patient awareness that eventually, inevitably, the mouse would be caught. She tore her eyes away and followed Mrs. Halloway up a grand staircase that curved like a spine toward the upper floors. Each step an effort, because her legs had been trembling since the auction house and showed no signs of stopping. The blue suite, when they reached it, was larger than the entire house Eleanor had grown up in, and infinitely grander than the single room she and Catherine had been forced to share after her husband's death left them penniless. The bedroom contained a four-poster bed that could have slept 6 people comfortably, with blue silk hangings that gave the room its name and curtains thick enough to block out any light. A sitting room adjoined it, complete with a writing desk, comfortable chairs arranged around a fireplace where flames already crackled, and bookshelves lined with volumes that Eleanor's fingers itched to explore despite her exhaustion. A third room, glimpsed through an open door, contained a copper bathtub large enough to drown in and more towels than any 2 people could possibly need. "The fires will be maintained throughout the night," Mrs. Halloway said, her tone suggesting this was an enormous concession rather than basic hospitality. "Food will be brought up shortly. His lordship asks that you not leave these rooms tonight, for your own safety as much as anything else. The manor is large, and guests have been known to become lost in the corridors after dark." It was a warning dressed as concern, and Eleanor heard it clearly. "Stay in your gilded cage, do not explore, do not ask questions, and perhaps you will survive whatever you have stumbled into." She nodded because arguing with the housekeeper would accomplish nothing, and Mrs. Halloway departed with a rustle of skirts that sounded like disapproval made audible. Eleanor carried Catherine to the enormous bed and laid her down gently, removing the child's worn shoes and covering her with blankets so soft they felt like touching clouds. Catherine stirred but did not wake, her small face finally peaceful in sleep, and Eleanor sat beside her for a long moment, just watching her breathe, reassuring herself that they were both still alive, both still together, that the nightmare of separation had been interrupted before it could become permanent. Her hands shook as she smoothed Catherine's hair back from her forehead, and only when she was certain the child was deeply asleep did she allow herself to stand and explore the rooms that were to be their prison or sanctuary. She had not yet decided which. The food arrived before she had finished her exploration, brought by a young maid who looked terrified and would not meet Eleanor's eyes, as if whatever Lord Draconis was might be contagious and could be caught through direct contact with his property. The tray contained soup that smelled like heaven, fresh bread with butter, roasted chicken that made Eleanor's stomach cramp with sudden desperate hunger, cheese, fruit, and a bottle of wine that probably cost more than she had earned in a month when she still had employment. Eleanor waited until the maid had scurried away before falling on the food with the desperation of someone who had been rationing single potatoes for weeks, forcing herself to eat slowly despite her body's demands, because she knew that eating too much too quickly after prolonged hunger would make her violently ill, and she needed to maintain her strength for whatever came next. She ate half of what was on the tray and saved the rest for Catherine, covering it carefully and placing it near the fire to stay warm. Then, because she was too exhausted to maintain vigilance any longer and too frightened to fully relax, Eleanor dragged one of the heavy chairs from the sitting room and wedged it under the door handle of the suite's entrance, creating a barrier that would at least make noise if someone attempted to enter during the night. It was a futile gesture, she knew, because if Lord Draconis wanted to enter these rooms, no chair would stop him. But it made her feel slightly more in control of a situation where she had no control whatsoever. She removed her worn dress and washed as best she could with the water in the basin, shocked at how dirty she had become without noticing during the weeks of running and hiding, and desperately trying to keep herself and Catherine alive. The mirror above the washstand showed her a stranger, gaunt and hollow-eyed, her dark hair tangled despite her attempts to maintain appearances. bruises on her arms from rough handling by the men who had captured them. She looked away quickly, unable to reconcile this haunted creature with the woman she had been a year ago, when her husband was still alive and their merchant business was thriving and the future seemed to contain nothing but modest prosperity and quiet happiness. Eleanor climbed into the bed beside Catherine and pulled the child close, breathing in the smell of her daughter's hair and trying not to think about how close they had come to losing each other forever. Sleep should have been impossible. Her mind should have been racing with plans and fears and questions about what morning would bring. But her body had reached the limits of endurance, and she fell into darkness like a stone dropping into a well, so deeply that she did not hear the door open hours later, or notice the figure that stood at the foot of the bed watching them with an expression too complex to name. Victor had not intended to check on them, had in fact given strict instructions to Mrs. Halloway that the blue suite was to remain undisturbed until morning. But he found himself climbing the stairs to the east wing regardless, drawn by an impulse he did not fully understand and could not justify. He stood in the doorway for a long time, his supernatural vision allowing him to see clearly despite the darkness, watching the way Eleanor held Catherine even in sleep, protective and fierce. The chair wedged under the door handle made him smile despite himself, a futile gesture of defiance that spoke volumes about the woman's character. And he was careful when he entered to move it silently, to leave no trace of his presence that might disturb the fragile sense of security Eleanor had constructed. He should not have been there. He should have been in his study, reviewing the consignment papers that Marlowe had delivered within the promised hour, learning the names of the men who had reduced Eleanor and Catherine to property and deciding what to do about them. He should have been planning how to minimize the damage from his public display in the auction house, how to manage the rumors that would inevitably spread about the reclusive Lord Draconis, who had appeared from nowhere to spend a fortune on 2 slaves and threaten anyone who challenged his claim. Instead, he stood in the dark watching a woman and child sleep, feeling emotions he had thought were long dead, stirring in the cold cavity where his heart used to beat. 347 years of existence, and he could not remember the last time he had cared about something beyond his own survival and comfort. He had loved once, or thought he had, back when he was still human, and the world made sense in ways it had not since his transformation. He had watched that love die slowly over decades as he remained unchanged and she aged and finally passed. And he had sworn then that he would never make that mistake again, never allow himself to become attached to creatures whose lives passed in the blink of an eye compared to his own eternity. He had kept that promise for nearly 3 centuries, maintaining distance and detachment, treating humans as necessary inconveniences at best and prey at worst, building a life defined by solitude and the careful cultivation of indifference. And then he had walked into an auction house looking to feed on ambient fear and found a woman who looked at her, captors with undisguised hatred, and a child whose silence spoke of trauma beyond words. And something in him had simply broken. Some carefully constructed wall had crumbled, and he had intervened without thinking about consequences or complications or the cost of caring about creatures who would be dead in a handful of decades while he continued unchanged. Victor reached out slowly, carefully, and let his fingers hover inches above Catherine's blonde hair, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her small body, but not quite touching, because touching would make this real in a way that simply observing did not. The child murmured something in her sleep, a word that sounded like "Papa," and Victor withdrew his hand as if burned, backing away from the bed with the sudden awareness that he was intruding on something private, something sacred, something that creatures like him had no right to witness. He left as silently as he had entered, replacing the chair under the door handle exactly as Eleanor had positioned it, and returned to his study, where the consignment papers waited with their catalogue of human cruelty. Victor spent the remainder of the night reading through the documents, learning that Eleanor's husband had been a merchant named Thomas Ashford, who had died 6 months ago from pneumonia, that his business had been over-leveraged, and his death had left Eleanor with debts she could not possibly repay, that the house had been seized and the few possessions of value sold to satisfy creditors, and that when even that was not enough, the debt had been transferred to Eleanor herself, who became legally responsible for her dead husband's failures. The papers showed that she had tried to work, had taken positions as a governess and a seamstress and a dozen other respectable occupations. But each time she had been dismissed when employers learned she had an unchaperoned child, as if Catherine's existence was somehow scandalous rather than simply the reality of a widow trying to survive. The final document explained how they had ended up in the auction house, and Victor felt his rage return as he read the clinical description of how Eleanor had been arrested for debt, how Catherine had been classified as dependent property, how they had been separated and processed and prepared for sale as if they were furniture being liquidated to pay off a bankrupt estate. The men responsible had names and addresses, and Victor committed each one to memory with the patient certainty that eventually, when Eleanor and Catherine were safe and settled, he would visit each of these men and explain personally why separating mothers from children was the kind of mistake that had permanent consequences. Dawn was breaking when Victor finally set the papers aside and allowed himself to acknowledge the truth he had been avoiding all night. He had not saved Eleanor and Catherine out of nobility or compassion or some buried remnant of his humanity. He had saved them because, in the moment when he saw them on that stage, chained together but facing separation, he had seen himself reflected back, had recognized the kind of isolation and loss that he had been living with for centuries. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he had wanted something beyond mere existence. He had wanted to matter to someone, to be something other than a predator hiding behind the veneer of civilization, to prove that 347 years of life had not completely destroyed his capacity to protect rather than destroy. It was selfish, he realized, monumentally, terribly selfish to involve them in his existence, to drag them into the orbit of a creature who would watch them age and die, while he remained unchanged, to offer them safety that came with the cost of proximity to something that should not exist. But Victor had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it meant to consider another person's needs above his own wants. And by the time he remembered, by the time he recognized the danger he was putting them in, simply by keeping them under his roof, the sun was rising and Eleanor was waking, and the moment to make the noble choice had passed. Eleanor opened her eyes to sunlight streaming through gaps in the blue silk curtains, and for one disoriented moment she could not remember where she was, could not reconcile the softness of the bed beneath her with the hardness of the past year. Then Catherine stirred beside her, and memory returned in a crushing wave. The auction house, the chains, the men bidding on her daughter-like property, and the strange pale nobleman who had appeared from nowhere to make it all stop. She sat up carefully, not wanting to wake Catherine yet, and saw that someone had been in the room during the night. The chair she had wedged under the door was still in place, but the food she had left for Catherine had been replaced with a fresh breakfast tray, and her worn dress had been taken and replaced with something clean and simple folded over the chair in the sitting room. Eleanor rose and examined the new dress. Plain dark blue wool with no ornamentation but well made, and more importantly, in her size. Someone had measured her with their eyes and guessed correctly, and she did not know whether to be grateful or disturbed by the attention to detail. She dressed quickly and checked on Catherine, who was still sleeping with the deep exhaustion of a child who had been pushed too far for too long, and decided to let her rest while she explored the boundaries of their new prison, The corridors outside the blue suite were empty and silent in the morning light, and Eleanor walked carefully, her footsteps muffled by thick carpets that probably cost more than she had earned in her entire life. She had no destination in mind, just a need to understand the shape of the cage they were in, to find exits and hiding places and vulnerabilities in case escape became necessary. The manor was even larger than she had realized from the entrance hall, a labyrinth of corridors and rooms that seemed to go on forever. And she was beginning to believe she was hopelessly lost when she heard voices coming from behind a partially open door. "You cannot be serious, my lord," Mrs. Halloway's voice sharp with disapproval. "You cannot simply install them in the manor as if they were guests. They are property, legally purchased, and they must be treated as such, or you risk creating impossible expectations." "They are not property." Victor's voice cold enough to freeze blood. "I purchased them to free them, not to own them. They will be treated as guests until such time as Mrs. Ashford decides what she wishes to do next. My lord, with all respect, that is not how this works. You paid 5,000 florins for them." 5,000! The entire city will know about it by now, and they will be watching to see what you do next. If you treat them as equals, as guests, people will talk. They will assume things about your relationship with the woman. And your reputation, my reputation, Victor interrupted, has survived 3 centuries of considerably more scandalous behavior than offering shelter to a widow and her child. I do not care what people assume, Mrs. Halloway. I care that they are safe, fed, and given time to recover from what they have endured. Is that understood? There was a long pause, and Eleanor held her breath, pressing herself against the wall outside the door where she could hear but not be seen. "As you wish." "My lord," Mrs. Halloway said finally, her tone making clear that she thought her employer was making an enormous mistake. "But when this ends badly, as it inevitably will, do not say I did not warn you." Eleanor heard footsteps approaching the door and ducked into a nearby alcove, watching as Mrs. Halloway emerged and stalked down the corridor with the rigid posture of someone deeply offended by the universe's refusal to operate according to her standards. When the housekeeper was gone, Eleanor stepped out and approached the door, which was still ajar, and peered inside to see Victor standing at a window with his back to her, his shoulders tense in a way that suggested the conversation with Mrs. Halloway had cost him more than he wanted to admit. "You can come in, Mrs. Ashford," Victor said without turning around, and Eleanor jumped because she had made no sound that human ears could have detected. "I know you have questions. I would prefer to answer them now rather than have you torture yourself with speculation." Eleanor hesitated, every instinct screaming at her not to enter a room alone with a man who could hear her breathing from behind a closed door. But curiosity and the need for answers won out over caution. She stepped inside, leaving the door open behind her as a token gesture toward propriety, and waited for Victor to turn and face her. When he did, she was struck again by how pale he was in daylight, how the sunlight streaming through the window seemed to make him almost translucent, and she remembered the way his eyes had turned black in the auction house and felt cold certainty settle in her stomach. "You're not human," Eleanor said flatly, deciding that dancing around the truth would accomplish nothing. "Whatever you are, you're not human, and you want something from me and Catherine. I need to know what, so I can decide whether we're safer here or running." Victor studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze, despite the fear curling in her chest. Finally he smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just a kind of sad recognition. "You are correct on all counts except the last," Victor said quietly. "I am not human. I am what people in your century call a vampire, though that word carries connotations that are not entirely accurate. I do want something from you, though I am still determining exactly what that is. And you are not safer running, because there is nowhere in this city you can go that I cannot find you, and nowhere in this world where men like the ones in the auction house do not exist. So the question is not whether you are safer here or running. Mrs. Ashford," The question is whether you trust me enough to stay until you have recovered your strength and can make an informed decision about your future, rather than running now out of fear and finding yourself back in chains within a week. It was brutal honesty, and Eleanor appreciated it even as it terrified her. She had suspected what he was, had seen enough in the auction house to piece together the truth. But hearing him confirm it was different, made it real in a way that suspicion never could. "What do you want from us?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Why did you intervene? Men like you don't spend fortunes on women like me without expecting something in return." Victor turned back to the window, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet Eleanor had to strain to hear it. "I intervened because I have lived for 347 years, and in all that time I have never seen anything as obscene as what was happening on that stage. I spent a fortune because money means nothing to me and you mean something. I do not know what yet. Perhaps you never will mean anything more than the memory of a good deed in a life otherwise defined by selfishness. But I'm tired, Mrs. Ashford. I am tired of being alone, tired of watching humanity at its worst and doing nothing, tired of pretending that I am content with an existence that has not held meaning in longer than I care to remember." He turned to face her again, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that looked almost human, almost vulnerable, almost like hope. "I want you to stay," Victor said simply. "I want you and Catherine to recover here, to heal from what was done to you, and when you are ready, I want you to teach me what it means to care about someone again. I want to remember what it was like to be part of something larger than myself. And in return, I will give you safety, resources, and time to rebuild your life however you choose. If you decide to leave when you are strong enough, I will not stop you. If you decide to stay, I will do everything in my considerable power to ensure that neither of you ever has to be afraid again." Eleanor stared at him, trying to process what she was hearing. It was the most honest, and simultaneously the most manipulative thing anyone had ever said to her. A confession wrapped in a transaction, wrapped in a plea, and she did not know whether to be moved or terrified by it. "You're asking me to stay in a manor with a vampire who admits he wants something from me that he cannot even define," Eleanor said slowly. "You're asking me to trust that you will not harm my daughter, that you will not use your power over us for purposes I cannot predict. You're asking me to believe that a creature who has lived for 3 centuries suddenly cares about the fate of a widow and her child." "Yes," Victor said. "That is exactly what I am asking. I know it is unreasonable. I know you have no rational basis for trust, but I am asking anyway, because I have nothing else to offer but honesty and hope, and I have not offered either to anyone in longer than you have been alive." Eleanor closed her eyes and thought of Catherine, still sleeping in the blue suite, finally safe and warm and fed after weeks of cold and hunger and terror. She thought of the men in the auction house, the ones who had bid on her daughter with eyes that promised nightmares. She thought of the winter outside and the streets of Vlachia, where women like her disappeared every day and no one noticed or cared. And she thought of the vampire standing before her, asking for something he could simply take if he chose, offering her a choice when he could have commanded obedience. 1 month, Eleanor said finally, opening her eyes to find Victor watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "We will stay 1 month. You will not touch Catherine. You will not attempt to feed on either of us, and you will provide us with money and letters of introduction so that when the month is over, we can leave and establish ourselves somewhere safe. In exchange, I will teach you what it means to care, if such a thing can even be taught. And if at any point I believe you are a threat to my daughter, I will find a way to kill you, vampire or not, even if it costs me my own life. Do we have an understanding?" Victor smiled, and this time there was warmth in it, genuine pleasure at her fierce protectiveness and her attempt to negotiate from a position of no power whatsoever. "We have an understanding, Mrs. Ashford, 1 month. And for what it is worth, if you ever do attempt to kill me, I promise to be impressed by your courage, even as I prevent you from succeeding. It was not exactly reassuring, but it was honest, and Eleanor found herself smiling despite the fear still coiling in her stomach. She had just made a bargain with a vampire, had agreed to stay in his home and teach him about human connection, and she had no idea whether she had just saved herself and Catherine or condemned them to a fate worse than the auction house. But for the first time in a year, she had made a choice rather than having choices made for her, and that alone felt like a kind of victory. However small and possibly futile it might prove to be, the first week passed in a strange, suspended reality that felt nothing like the life Eleanor had known before, and everything like a dream from which she kept expecting to wake. Catherine recovered faster than Eleanor had anticipated, the resilience of childhood asserting itself as proper food and warmth worked their magic on her small body. The hollows beneath her eyes filled in, color returned to her cheeks, and by the fourth day she was exploring the manor, with the fearless curiosity of a 10-year-old who had decided that whatever monsters might lurk in the shadows were less frightening than the monsters they had already survived. Eleanor watched her daughter's transformation with a mixture of relief and grief, grateful for the healing but mourning the innocence that could never be restored, the trust in the world's goodness that had been shattered on an auction block and could not be mended, no matter how safe their current circumstances. Victor kept his distance during those first days, appearing only at dinner time when he would sit across from them in the manor's smaller dining room and engage in stilted conversation that revealed nothing about himself and everything about his profound because I could not bear it anymore, Victor said simply. Sarah was the last, and when she died I swore I would never again allow myself to care for anyone mortal, would never again endure the particular agony of watching someone I loved fade away while I remained frozen in time. I kept that promise for 15 years, Eleanor. 15 years of careful isolation, of maintaining distance, of treating humans as scenery rather than participants in my existence. And then I walked into an auction house and saw you and Catherine on that stage, and every wall I had built crumbled in an instant. Eleanor turned to face him, seeing the naked vulnerability in his expression, the fear of rejection warring with the desperate hope that she might choose him, despite the inevitable pain such a choice guaranteed. You are asking me to love you knowing that it will end in heartbreak, she said slowly. You are asking me to give Catherine a father figure who will attend her funeral and her children's funerals and her grandchildren's funerals while remaining eternally unchanged. You are asking us to accept that every moment of happiness will be shadowed by the knowledge of its impermanence. Yes, Victor said. That is exactly what I am asking, and I know it is monstrously selfish. I know I should send you away with money and references and every advantage I can provide, should let you build a life that does not include me and the complications of my nature. But I am 347 years old, Eleanor, and I have learned that we do not choose who we love or when. We can only choose whether to be brave enough to admit it and fight for it despite all the reasons it is impossible. I love you. I love Catherine, and if you can find even a fraction of those feelings for me, I will give you everything I have and everything I am for however long you have to give. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, and she did not try to stop them, did not try to hide the emotional storm Victor's words had unleashed. She thought of Thomas, her dead husband, who she had loved with the comfortable affection of shared goals and modest dreams. And she thought of Victor, who offered her a love so intense it terrified her, who promised to treasure every moment because he understood their scarcity in ways normal humans never could. She thought of Catherine, who deserved safety and education, and the freedom to become whoever she wished without fear of poverty or cruelty. And she thought of herself, 28 years old and exhausted from fighting a world that had tried to destroy her, being offered refuge and love and partnership by someone who would literally die defending them, if such a thing were possible. I am terrified, Eleanor whispered. I am terrified of loving you and losing you, even though I know it will be the opposite. that you will lose us and carry that loss forever. I'm terrified of what people will say when they learn a widow is living with a nobleman, under circumstances that are not marriage, but something far more complicated. I am terrified that I'm making this decision out of desperation rather than genuine feeling, that I am confusing gratitude with love and security with affection. Those are all reasonable fears, Victor said gently. I cannot promise that loving me will not be difficult or that there will not be times you regret your choice. But I can promise that I will spend every day trying to make that choice worthwhile. That I will protect you and Catherine with everything I have. And that when the end comes, as it inevitably must, I will hold your hand and be grateful for every moment we had, rather than bitter about the moments we did not get. Is that enough, Eleanor? Can that be enough? Eleanor closed the distance between them and took Victor's cold hands in her warm ones, feeling the contrast that would define their relationship if she chose to stay. The living and the undead attempting to build something beautiful from impossibility. Ask me again, she said quietly. Ask me properly, not as lord to refugee, but as man to woman, and I will give you my answer. Victor knelt before her in that chamber of painted memories, surrounded by the ghosts of everyone he had loved and lost, and spoke words that should have sounded absurd, but instead rang with absolute sincerity. Eleanor Ashford, will you stay with me? Will you let me love you and Catherine for as long as you both shall live? Will you teach me what it means to be part of a family again, to care about something beyond my own survival? Will you give me the honor and privilege of spending your remaining years trying to make you happy, even though I know those years will pass far too quickly and end in the kind of pain that never fully heals? Yes, Eleanor said, and felt the word transform everything. Felt the careful distance she had been maintaining shatter completely, as she allowed herself to truly see Victor, not as savior or monster, but as simply a man, or something close enough to a man, who loved her and was terrified of losing her and was brave enough to ask for her heart, despite knowing he would one day have to let it go. Yes, Victor, I will stay. I will love you and let you love us, and we will build something beautiful in the time we have, and when that time ends, you will carry our memory with honor rather than regret. This I promise you. Victor rose and pulled her into an embrace that was careful and desperate in equal measure, his cold body against her warm one, and Eleanor felt his shoulders shake with sobs he had probably been holding back for decades or centuries. She held him while he wept, this ancient creature reduced to simple human emotion by the acceptance he had not believed he deserved. And she understood with sudden clarity that love was always a risk, always a gamble on insufficient odds. But it was the only gamble that made existence meaningful, whether you had 40 years or 400. When they finally pulled apart, Victor's face was transformed by joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. I need to tell you something else, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Something I probably should have mentioned earlier, but was too afraid would drive you away. Eleanor felt a spike of fear, wondering what revelation could possibly be worse than everything she already knew. But she steeled herself and nodded for him to continue. There is a way, Victor said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, for you to become what I am. It is dangerous and painful and not guaranteed to succeed, but it is possible to turn a human into a vampire if both parties are willing. I will never ask this of you, Eleanor, and I will never ask it of Catherine when she is old enough to understand the choice. But I want you to know that the option exists, that you do not have to age and die if you choose not to, that there is a path where we could potentially have centuries together rather than just decades. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling from this new information. You are telling me I could become immortal, that I could stay with you forever? Yes, Victor said, but you must understand what you would be giving up. You would never see another sunrise without pain, never taste normal food again, never have more children, never be fully human. You would become a predator, Eleanor, something that must consume blood to survive. Something that exists outside the normal boundaries of human society. It is not a gift, despite what those who romanticize vampirism might believe. It is a curse that happens to include immortality, and you should only consider it if you are certain that the cost is worth the reward." "And Catherine?" Eleanor asked, her mind immediately jumping to her daughter's future. "When she is grown, when she has lived a full human life and experienced everything mortality has to offer, then and only then would I ever broach the subject with her," Victor said firmly. "And only if she asked, Eleanor. I would never pressure her or you into such a choice. I'm simply telling you it exists so that you know all the options available before you plan your future." Eleanor nodded slowly, filing this information away to process later when her emotions were less overwhelming. "I need time to think about that," she said. "Years probably to understand what such a choice would mean. Can we table this discussion until I have had time to live with you, to understand your existence more fully?" "Of course," Victor agreed immediately. "We have time, Eleanor. For the first time in longer than I can remember. We have time." They returned to the upper floors hand in hand, and Eleanor felt as if she were floating, as if some fundamental weight had been lifted from her shoulders by the simple act of making a choice and committing to it fully. When they reached her chambers, Victor kissed her gently, carefully, his cold lips against her warm ones, and Eleanor tasted centuries of loneliness in that kiss. Tasted the desperate gratitude of someone who had been certain they would spend eternity alone and had suddenly been proven wrong. "I love you," Victor whispered against her mouth. "I will love you until the stars burn out and beyond, Eleanor. This I swear. I love you too," Eleanor whispered back, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Practical concerns and impossible complications be damned. The next morning, Eleanor told Catherine about her decision to stay permanently, and the child's response was to launch herself at Eleanor with enough force to nearly knock them both over, laughing and crying simultaneously with relief and joy. "I knew you would choose him," Catherine said through her tears. "I knew you were smart enough to see what I saw." "And what did you see?" Eleanor asked, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Someone who needs us as much as we need him," Catherine said simply. "Someone who was lost until we found him. Just like we were lost until he found us." That evening, Victor gathered them both in the Manor's music room, where a piano Eleanor had not known existed waited with sheet music scattered across its surface. "I have not played for anyone in a very long time," Victor said nervously, "but I wanted to mark this occasion with something beautiful, something that represents what you both mean to me." He sat at the piano and began to play, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as music filled the room with haunting beauty. Victor played as only someone with centuries of practice could play, his cold fingers moving across the keys with supernatural precision, coaxing sounds from the instrument that seemed impossible, that seemed to contain all the love and loss and desperate hope that defined his existence. Catherine sat beside Eleanor on the sofa, holding her mother's hand and watching Victor with wide eyes. And Eleanor understood that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a moment of perfect vulnerability from a creature who had spent lifetimes hiding his true self from the world. When the music ended, the silence that followed was profound, broken only by Catherine's voice asking the question that would change everything again. "Victor, will you teach me to play like that? I want to make beautiful things too." Victor's expression as he looked at Catherine was pure love, pure paternal pride that he had never expected to feel, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I would be honored to teach you, Catherine. We have years ahead of us, and I will teach you everything I know about making beauty in a world that often seems determined to destroy it." Eleanor watched them together, the ancient vampire and the young girl, and felt her heart expand with a happiness so intense it was almost painful. They were not a conventional family, would never be accepted by society as anything other than scandalous at best. But they were real, and they were choosing each other, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 23 years passed like water through fingers, simultaneously endless and impossibly brief. And Victor learned that immortality took on different dimensions when measured against the lives of those you loved. He watched Catherine grow from a traumatized 10-year-old into a confident young woman of 33, educated beyond what most men of her era could claim, fluent in 4 languages, accomplished at piano in ways that made audiences weep, and fierce in her defense of those without power, because she remembered what it felt like to stand on an auction block waiting to be sold. She had married at 25, a kind young physician named James, who had courted her for 2 years, before Victor finally accepted that the man genuinely loved Catherine, for herself rather than for the substantial dowry Victor had provided. They had given Victor 2 grandchildren, neither of whom shared his blood, but both of whom called him grandfather with unself-conscious affection that made his ancient heart ache with joy and impending loss. Eleanor had aged with the kind of grace that made Victor's chest constrict every time he looked at her. Her dark hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with wrinkles that mapped their years together like a topographical chart of shared joy and sorrow. She was 51 years old, and while she remained healthy and vital, Victor could see the subtle changes that presaged mortality's approach. The way she moved slightly more carefully than she once had, the way she tired more easily. The small concessions to age that were invisible to human eyes but glaring to a vampire who had memorized every detail of her face and body over 2 decades of desperate love. They had built a life together that defied convention and scandalized polite society. But within the walls of Victor's manor, they had created something beautiful and true. Eleanor had become his partner in every sense, managing his estates with skill that tripled their value, corresponding with scholars across Europe who sought Victor's expertise on historical matters, filling the manor with warmth and laughter and life in ways he had not experienced in centuries. They had never married, because the legal complications of explaining Victor's lack of aging would have been insurmountable. But everyone who mattered understood that they were bound together by something far stronger than legal contracts, by choice renewed every morning when Eleanor woke beside his cold body and chose again to love him despite the growing awareness that their time was finite. The crisis came on a winter evening, much like the one when they first met. 23 years ago, almost to the day, and it came with the same brutal efficiency that mortality always employed. Eleanor collapsed while walking in the garden, her hand slipping from Victor's arm as she fell, and in the terrible seconds before he caught her, Victor saw his future without her stretch ahead like an endless wasteland. The physician came immediately, James's colleague who had been treating Eleanor's increasingly frequent headaches, and his diagnosis was delivered with professional detachment that barely concealed his sympathy. A growth in her brain, inoperable, probably present for months and now progressing rapidly. She had weeks, perhaps a month if they were fortunate. And there was nothing that 19th century medicine could do except make her comfortable and wait for the inevitable. Victor carried Eleanor to their chambers and laid her in the bed they had shared for 23 years, and when Catherine arrived with her children, he saw his own anguish reflected in her face. She knelt beside her mother and took her hand, and Eleanor smiled with the serenity of someone who had lived fully and had no regrets about the choices that brought her to this moment. "I am not afraid," Eleanor said quietly, her voice slightly slurred by whatever was happening in her brain. "I have had 23 years I never expected to have. Loved and been loved by the 2 most important people in my life. Watched my daughter flourish into someone extraordinary. Met my grandchildren, and filled every day with as much joy as I could hold. How many people can say that, Victor? How many people get to live so well?" Victor could not speak, could not force words past the grief closing his throat, and so he simply held her hand and tried to memorize the warmth of it, because soon, so terribly soon, that warmth would be gone forever. Catherine was crying silently, her tears falling on her mother's hand, and her children stood in the doorway looking confused and frightened because they were too young to understand death, but old enough to recognize its approach. The days that followed were the longest of Victor's existence, each hour an agony of watching Eleanor slip away by degrees. She remained lucid for the first week, able to speak and laugh, and offer comfort to those who should have been comforting her. And she used that time to say goodbye with the deliberate care of someone who understood she would not get a second chance. She held each grandchild and told them stories about their mother's childhood, gave Catherine letters she had written over the years to be opened at important moments in her daughter's future, and spent hours with Victor talking about nothing and everything, trying to compress a lifetime of conversations into the little time remaining. On the 8th day, Eleanor asked Victor to bring her to the chamber beneath the manor, the gallery of portraits where he had first confessed his love. He carried her down the stairs, her body so light now that it terrified him, and placed her gently in a chair facing the walls covered in painted memories. "I want you to paint me," Eleanor said. "I want my portrait here with the others, so that when I'm gone, you can remember not just how I looked, but how you saw me. Will you do this for me, Victor?" Victor had not painted since Sarah died 15 years before Eleanor entered his life, had sworn he would never again create another memorial to love and loss. But he found himself nodding because he could deny Eleanor nothing, especially not now. He painted through the night and into the next day, working with desperate speed because he could see her fading, could hear her heartbeat growing weaker and more erratic. He painted her not as she was now, diminished by illness, but as she had been throughout their years together, strong and beautiful and filled with the fierce determination that had first captured his attention on an auction block 23 years ago. He painted her eyes with their keen intelligence, her mouth with its slight smile that suggested she knew secrets the world had not yet discovered, her hands with their capable grace. He painted love itself, immortalized in oil and canvas, and when he finally set down his brush, Eleanor was crying. "It is perfect," she whispered. "That is exactly how I wanted you to remember me." They returned to their chambers, and that night Eleanor's pain grew worse despite the laudanum the physician prescribed. Victor held her through the agony, his own pain invisible but equally intense. And sometime near dawn, she gripped his hand with surprising strength and spoke the words he had been dreading and expecting in equal measure. "Turn me," Eleanor said clearly. "Victor, I know what I said 23 years ago about needing time to decide, and I have had that time. I do not want to leave you. I do not want Catherine to lose me. I want more years with all of you. And if becoming what you are is the price for those years, then I will pay it gladly. Please, Victor, I am begging you. Do not let me die when there is another option." Victor felt his heart, which had not beat in 3 centuries, seem to constrict in his chest. "Eleanor, you do not understand what you are asking. The transformation is agonizing, and it fails more often than it succeeds. You could die in worse pain than you are experiencing now. And even if it succeeds, you will no longer be human, will never again see daylight without pain, will never taste normal food, will have to consume blood to survive. This is not a gift, my love. It is a curse." "It is a choice," Eleanor corrected, her green eyes fierce despite the pain ravaging her body. "A choice I am making with full knowledge of the consequences. I've lived as a human, Victor. I've experienced everything mortality offers. Now I want to experience what comes next, with you beside me. Please do not deny me this, because you think you know better than I do what I need." Catherine had entered the room at some point during this exchange, and she moved to sit on the other side of her mother's bed. "Do it," Catherine said firmly. "Mama has earned the right to choose her own fate. And if she chooses you and immortality, then you must respect that choice, Victor. We do not get to make decisions for the people we love. We can only support them in their choices and hope for the best." Victor looked between them. The woman he loved, who was asking him to transform her into something not quite human, and the daughter he had raised, who was giving him permission to attempt what might kill Eleanor more quickly than the disease already ravaging her brain. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to let Eleanor die naturally and peacefully, rather than risk the agony and potential failure of transformation. But he understood that refusing would be the ultimate act of selfishness, would be prioritizing his own fear over Eleanor's autonomy. "If I do this," Victor said slowly, "and you survive the transformation, you will wake to a world that looks different, feels different, where your own daughter will age and die while you remain unchanged. You will watch Catherine grow old. Victor will watch her grandchildren grow old, and you will carry that pain forever alongside the joy of having more time. Are you certain this is what you want, Eleanor? Are you absolutely certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything," Eleanor said. "I love you enough to become a monster, if that is what being with you requires. Now please, Victor, before my courage fails or the pain makes me senseless, do what needs to be done." Victor leaned down and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, trying to memorize the warmth that might not survive the transformation. Then he pulled back and allowed his true nature to surface, allowed his eyes to turn black and his fangs to extend. And he saw Eleanor's eyes widen not with fear, but with something that looked remarkably like wonder. "I love you," Victor whispered, and buried his fangs in Eleanor's throat. The transformation took 3 days. 3 days of Eleanor screaming with agony as her human body died, and something new struggled to emerge from the ruins. Victor never left her side, holding her through the convulsions, wiping the sweat from her face, whispering encouragement and love and desperate prayers to gods he no longer believed in. Catherine came and went, unable to watch her mother's suffering, but unable to stay away, and Victor saw the terrible guilt in her eyes, the awareness that she had encouraged this choice, and now her mother might die because of it. On the morning of the 4th day, Eleanor opened her eyes, and Victor knew immediately that the transformation had succeeded, because her eyes were no longer the warm green he had loved, but solid black, pupils dilated with newborn hunger. She sat up with the supernatural speed of vampire reflexes and looked around the room, with senses suddenly amplified beyond human comprehension, and Victor watched her process the overwhelming flood of new information. The ability to hear heartbeats in distant rooms, to smell the blood pumping through living veins, to see in perfect clarity despite the room's darkness. "Victor," Eleanor said, and her voice was the same but different, carrying harmonics that human vocal cords could not produce. "What have I become?" "You have become like me," Victor said quietly. "You have become something that should not exist but does anyway, something beautiful and terrible and eternal. How do you feel?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, cataloguing internal changes with the analytical mind that had served her well as a human and apparently survived transformation intact. "I feel strong," she said finally, "powerful in ways I cannot fully articulate, and hungry, Victor. I'm so hungry." Victor had prepared for this, had secured blood from a physician friend who asked no questions, and he brought it to Eleanor now. She drank with desperate need, and Victor saw relief flood her face as the hunger dimmed to manageable levels. When she finally set down the empty glass, her eyes had returned to their normal green, and she looked at Victor with an expression of wonder and relief. "It worked," Eleanor said, as if she had not quite believed it would. "I'm like you now. We have time, Victor. We have centuries." Victor pulled her into his arms and held her with the knowledge that she no longer needed gentleness, that she was now strong enough to withstand the full force of his embrace. And he wept with relief and joy and terror at what they had done. Eleanor held him back, her new strength evident in the way she could match his grip, and they clung to each other like survivors of a shipwreck finally reaching shore. Catherine arrived later that morning, and Eleanor embraced her daughter with careful restraint because she was still learning to control her new strength. "I know this changes everything," Eleanor said quietly. "I know that I will watch you age and eventually die while I remain frozen at 51 years old. I know that this choice means accepting pain I cannot yet fully comprehend. But I also know that I could not leave you, Catherine. I could not leave either of you when there was another option. Can you forgive me for choosing immortality over dying with grace?" Catherine was crying, but she was also smiling, her expression reflecting complicated emotions that defied simple categorization. "There is nothing to forgive, Mama. You chose life and love, and those are always the right choices. We will have more time together, and when my time comes, you will send me off knowing that you lived fully and loved fiercely and never surrendered to fear. That is all any child can ask of their parent." The years that followed were both easier and harder than Victor had anticipated. Eleanor adapted to her new existence with characteristic determination, learning to control her strength and hunger, mastering the subtle arts of appearing human enough to avoid suspicion. They moved away from Vlachia eventually, starting fresh in a new city where no one knew their history, where they could be simply a devoted couple who happened to never age. Catherine and her family visited regularly, and Victor watched his daughter grow older with the bittersweet awareness that he and Eleanor would eventually attend her funeral, would say goodbye to the child who had taught him what it meant to love unconditionally. Catherine died at 78 years old, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and Eleanor and Victor held her hands as she slipped away with the same grace she had approached everything else in her remarkable life. Her last words were for them, "Thank you for saving us that night in the auction house. Thank you for showing me that families are built through choice and love rather than blood alone. Thank you for every moment." Victor and Eleanor grieved together, two immortal creatures mourning someone mortal they had loved beyond reason. And in their shared sorrow, they found a deeper connection, an understanding that loss was the price of love, and that price was worth paying every time. They had centuries ahead of them now, eternities to fill with new experiences and new relationships. But they would carry Catherine with them always, her memory preserved perfectly in their immortal minds, a reminder of why they had chosen each other and what made existence meaningful despite its impossibility. 50 years after Catherine's death, Victor and Eleanor stood in the chamber beneath their new manor, surrounded by portraits spanning 4 centuries, and Eleanor squeezed his cold hand with her equally cold fingers. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Do you regret turning me, giving me immortality, condemning me to watch everyone we love eventually die?" Victor considered the question carefully, looking at the walls covered in painted memories of love and loss. "I regret that you must carry that pain," he said finally. "I regret that Catherine is not here to see what we have built together. But I do not regret having you beside me, Eleanor. I do not regret the choice you made, or the choice I made to honor your wishes. We have centuries ahead of us, and I will spend every moment grateful that you chose to stay." Eleanor smiled, and it was the same fierce, determined smile she had worn on an auction block 150 years ago when she was still human and still fighting for her daughter's life. "Then we have succeeded, Victor. We have taken something that should have been tragedy and transformed it into love. We have proven that even monsters can build something beautiful if they are brave enough to try. And we will continue, for as long as existence allows, honoring those we have loved and lost by living fully and choosing connection over isolation." They stood together in the candlelit chamber, two immortal creatures who had found each other against impossible odds, who had built a family from rescue and necessity and deliberate choice, who had learned that forever was both gift and burden, and that love made the burden bearable. Above them, in the manor's music room, a piano waited silent because the person who had learned to play it was decades dead. But her music lived on in their memories, perfect and eternal, a reminder that some things transcended mortality and some bonds could not be broken even by death. Victor pulled Eleanor close, and she leaned into his embrace, and together they climbed the stairs from the Chamber of Memories toward whatever centuries waited ahead, carrying their dead with them, honoring the past by living fully in the present. Two creatures who should not exist but did anyway, proving that love, however impossible, however complicated, however painful, was always worth fighting for, always worth choosing, always enough to make even immortality meaningful. They had been saved from an auction block by a vampire noble who interrupted a transaction that would have destroyed them, and in saving them, he had saved himself. And together they had built something eternal from the wreckage of that night, something that would endure as long as they both existed, a testament to the truth that families are forged in the fires of shared suffering and emerge stronger than any bond that blood alone could create, and that love, true love, the kind worth dying for and worth living for, transcends every boundary that mortality or immortality could possibly impose.